I, 35 am facing the hardest decision of my life, whether or not to attend my daughter's, 18 feuds, high school graduation. This might sound ridiculous to most people. After all, what kind of father would even consider missing such an important milestone in his child's life? But the situation is far more complicated and painful than it appears on the surface. 15 years ago, my world fell apart when my wife left us for a wealthy man she'd been having an affair with. I was blindsided, devastated, and suddenly thrust into the role of a single parent to our then 3-year-old daughter. Since that day, I've dedicated every waking moment to raising her, often at great personal cost. It hasn't been easy, especially financially, but somehow we've managed to scrape by. Now, my little girl is all grown up and about to graduate high school with honors. I should be bursting with pride, and don't get me wrong, I am incredibly proud of her achievements. But this joy is tainted by a deep sense of betrayal and hurt. You see, my daughter has asked her mother to play a significant role in the graduation ceremony instead of me. When she told me, it felt like a knife to my heart. "Dad," she said, her eyes pleading for understanding, "you're important to me, but Mom is family too. Can't you understand that?" But how can I understand? How can I reconcile the fact that my daughter seems to value her mother, who abandoned her, as much as she values me, the parent who has been there through every skinned knee, every nightmare, every triumph and failure? I've tried explaining to my daughter how much her mother hurt us when she left, but she just shakes her head and says, "Let's leave the past in the past, Dad. Can't we all just move forward?" Her words, while well-intentioned, feel like they're dismissing the years of pain and struggle we've been through. To add insult to injury, I recently overheard my daughter on the phone talking about how her boyfriend's parents are concerned about my lower social status. Apparently, they've been asking if I have plans to go back to school or get a better job. It's as if all my years of hard work and sacrifice mean nothing because I don't have a college degree or a high-paying job. Now, as the graduation looms closer, I'm torn. Do I swallow my pride, paste on a smile, and attend the ceremony, knowing I'll be relegated to the background while my ex-wife plays the role of the proud parent? Or do I stand my ground and refuse to go, even if it means potentially damaging my relationship with my daughter forever? To truly understand the depth of my dilemma, let me take you back to the beginning. When my ex-wife left, I was working as a truck driver. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills and allowed me to provide for my family. I didn't have a college degree, we'd married young, and I'd gone straight into working to support us. After the divorce, juggling my job with taking care of a toddler seemed impossible at first. I can't count the number of times I came home from a long haul, bone-tired and aching, only to have to summon the energy to cook dinner, help with homework, and tuck my little girl into bed. There were nights when I'd sit on the edge of my bed after she'd fallen asleep, wondering how I was going to make it through another day. But I did make it through. Day after day, year after year. I learned to braid hair. My early attempts were pretty terrible, but I got better. I attended every parent-teacher conference. I cheered at every school play and sports event. I even chaperoned her first school dance, much to her mortification. I did everything in my power to make sure she never felt the absence of her mother too keenly. Financially, it was always a struggle. There were months when I had to choose between paying the electricity bill and buying new shoes for my growing daughter. I always chose her needs over mine. I can't count the number of times I went to bed hungry so she could have a full meal. I took on extra shifts, worked holidays, did whatever I could to make ends meet. Despite the financial hardships, I made sure my daughter had opportunities. I encouraged her to join school clubs, helped her with science fair projects, and somehow scraped together money for guitar lessons when she showed an interest in music. I wanted her to have the kind of childhood I never had, filled with opportunities and experiences. The reality of my job as a truck driver meant that I often had to be away from home for days at a time. This was especially hard when my daughter was younger. I can still remember the tears in her eyes every time I had to leave for a long haul. It broke my heart, but I knew I had to do it to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. During those early years, I relied heavily on my parents and a handful of close friends to help with childcare. My mom would often stay at our house while I was on the road, making sure my daughter was taken care of. I don't know what I would have done without her support. There were times when the loneliness of the open road was almost unbearable. I'd be driving through the night, the radio my only companion, thinking about my little girl back home. Was she okay? Did she miss me? Was I doing the right thing by being away so much? These questions would gnaw at me, but I'd push them aside, focusing on the fact that every mile I drove was putting food on our table and clothes on her back. As she grew older, my daughter's interests and needs changed, presenting new challenges. When she was 12, she became obsessed with learning to play the guitar. I knew how important it was for her to have an outlet, something that was just hers, especially given our circumstances. But guitar lessons were expensive, and buying an instrument was out of the question. I spent weeks scouring pawn shops and online marketplaces, finally finding a second-hand guitar that was in decent condition. To pay for it, I picked up extra shifts and sold my prized collection of vintage vinyl records. Seeing her face light up when I gave her that guitar made it all worth it. I'll never forget the first song she learned to play. It was Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton. She insisted on performing it for me, and even though she hit more wrong notes than right ones, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. All these years, my ex-wife would breeze in and out of our lives as she pleased. She'd show up with expensive gifts for our daughter, designer clothes, the latest gadgets, things I could never afford to give her. It hurt to see how excited my daughter would get over these gifts, knowing I could never provide anything so lavish. I tried not to be bitter. I told myself that what mattered was that my daughter was happy. But it was hard not to feel resentful when I saw how easily my ex-wife could buy our daughter's affection, while I was the one there day in and day out, dealing with the mundane realities of raising a child. As my daughter entered her teenage years, things got more complicated. She started to ask more questions about her mother, about why she left. I tried to be honest without being cruel, but it was a difficult balance to strike. I didn't want to poison my daughter against her mother, but I also didn't want to sugarcoat the pain and betrayal I had experienced. I noticed that my daughter started to prefer spending time with her mother. Weekends at her mother's house meant shopping trips, fancy restaurants, and all the things I couldn't provide. When she came home, she'd be full of stories about the amazing time she'd had. It was like a knife to my heart every time. But I smiled and listened, not wanting to dim her happiness. At first, I was cautiously optimistic about my ex-wife's increased involvement. Maybe, I thought, she'd finally realized what she'd been missing all these years. Maybe she wanted to make amends. But as time went on, I realized that her increased presence wasn't making things easier, it was complicating them. She'd swoop in with expensive gifts and exciting weekend plans, then disappear again for weeks. It was like she was playing the role of the fun aunt rather than a mother. I tried to talk to her about it once. She needs stability, I said. She needs to know she can count on you. My ex-wife just laughed. Don't be so serious, she said. I'm giving her experiences you can't. Isn't that what matters? Her words stung because there was a grain of truth to them. She could give our daughter things I couldn't: trips to exotic places, designer clothes, connections to a world of wealth and privilege. and I could see how much our daughter enjoyed these things. As my daughter spent more time with her mother, I noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She became more brand conscious, more aware of social status. She'd make offhand comments about our small house or my old truck that she never would have made before. Each one was like a small knife to my heart. The situation with my daughter's boyfriend and his family added another layer of complexity. They come from old money, the kind of wealth that's been in the family for generations. The first time I met them was at a dinner they hosted. I felt out of place the moment I walked into their mansion. The father, a successful corporate lawyer, spent the evening talking about his recent trip to the Maldives and the new yacht he was thinking of buying. The mother, dripping in diamonds, asked me what I did for a living with a tone that made it clear she already knew and didn't approve. I tried to engage in the conversation to show them that I might not be wealthy, but I was a good father who had raised a wonderful daughter. But every time I spoke, I could feel their polite disinterest. They'd nod and smile, then quickly turn the conversation back to topics I couldn't contribute to: boarding schools in Switzerland, summer homes in the Hamptons, investment strategies. My daughter, I noticed, seemed different around them. She laughed at jokes I didn't understand, dropped names of designers I'd never heard of, and spoke about places she'd never been, as if she knew them intimately. It was like watching a chameleon change colors, and I didn't recognize the person she became in their presence. After that dinner, I overheard her talking to her boyfriend. "Your parents are so nice," she said. "Do you think they liked me?" The insecurity in her voice broke my heart. This was my confident, strong-willed daughter, suddenly unsure of herself because she wanted to fit into this world that was so foreign to us. Her boyfriend's response didn't help. "They think you're great," he said. "They just worry about, your background." But I told them it doesn't matter to me. I wanted to burst into the room and tell them both that there was nothing wrong with our background, that I had worked hard every day of my life to give my daughter a good home and a loving family. That wealth didn't equal worth, but I held back, not wanting to embarrass my daughter further. Now, with this graduation situation, I feel like all my efforts have been for nothing. My daughter seems to value the material things her mother can provide more than the years of love and sacrifice I've given her. When she told me about wanting her mother to play a significant role in the graduation, I couldn't hide my hurt. "After everything I've done for you," I said, my voice cracking with emotion, "after all these years of being there for you, how can you choose her over me?" My daughter looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Dad, it's not about choosing her over you. I love you both. Can't you understand that?" But I couldn't understand. How could she love someone who had abandoned her equally to the person who had given up everything for her? It felt like a betrayal of everything we'd been through together. As the graduation approached, the tension in our house grew. Every conversation seemed to revolve around the ceremony: who would be there, what role everyone would play. My ex-wife called frequently, discussing plans with our daughter, as if I wasn't even in the picture. One evening, about a week before the graduation, I finally broke down. "Why is this so important to you?" I asked my daughter. "Why does your mother need to have this big role in the ceremony when she hasn't been there for you all these years?" My daughter looked at me with a mix of frustration and sadness. "Dad, you don't understand. This isn't about who's been there more or who deserves what. It's about having my whole family together for one important day. Can't you just be happy for me?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was I being selfish? Was I letting my hurt and resentment overshadow what should be a joyous occasion for my daughter? But at the same time, how could I just smile and pretend that everything was okay when it felt like my heart was breaking? I spent that night tossing and turning, memories flooding my mind. I remembered the first time I held my daughter in my arms, this tiny, perfect being that I swore to protect and love forever. I thought about all the milestones we'd been through together, her first steps, her first day of school, her first heartbreak. I had been there for all of it, every step of the way. But I also thought about the things I couldn't give her, the vacations we never took, the new clothes we couldn't afford, the opportunities that were out of reach because of our financial situation. Had I done enough? Had my best been good enough? As dawn broke, I was no closer to a decision. The graduation was now just days away, and I was running out of time. I knew that whatever choice I made would have lasting consequences. If I went, I risked having to watch from the sidelines as my ex-wife played the role of the proud parent. If I didn't go, I risked damaging my relationship with my daughter irreparably. So here I am, turning to strangers on the internet for advice. I never thought I'd be in this position. I always believed that the love between a parent and child was unbreakable, that the years of care and sacrifice would always be recognized and appreciated. But now I'm not so sure. I love my daughter more than anything in this world. Everything I've done for the past 15 years has been for her. But I'm also human. I have my own feelings, my own need for recognition and appreciation. Is it wrong of me to want that? Am I being selfish for feeling hurt and betrayed? What would you do in my situation? How do I balance my own emotional needs with my love for my daughter? Is there a way to salvage this situation? Or have I already lost her to a world I can never be part of? Any advice would be deeply appreciated. The clock is ticking, and I've never felt more lost or alone. Update 1. It's been 2 days since the graduation ceremony, and I'm still reeling from what happened. I decided to attend, thinking I could put my feelings aside for my daughter's sake. I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived early, hoping to have a moment with my daughter before everything began. As I waited outside the auditorium, I saw my ex-wife pull up in a sleek, expensive car with her partner, 45M. My heart sank as I watched my daughter rush over to greet them, her face lighting up as her mother handed her a gift. I stood there, feeling invisible, the small bouquet of flowers I had brought suddenly seeming inadequate. When my daughter finally noticed me, she came over with a quick hug. "Dad, you came," she said. "Thanks for the flowers. Can you hold on to them for me? I need to go get ready." Before I could say anything, she was gone, rushing off with her mother. The ceremony itself was a blur. I found myself seated in the middle of the auditorium, while my ex-wife and her partner had prime seats near the front. As the graduates filed in, I craned my neck to catch a glimpse of my daughter. When I finally saw her, my breath caught in my throat. She looked beautiful, confident, and so grown up. But my pride was short-lived. As the principal began to speak, I noticed my ex-wife's partner acting strangely. He kept shifting in his seat, pulling out his phone, and whispering to my ex-wife. Just as my daughter's name was called to receive her diploma, I heard a commotion from the front of the auditorium. To my horror, I saw my ex-wife's partner stumbling to his feet, clearly intoxicated. He started shouting, "That's my girl. That's my baby girl." The entire auditorium fell silent. My daughter, who had been walking across the stage with a bright smile, froze, her face a mask of shock and embarrassment. My ex-wife was tugging at her partner's arm, trying to get him to sit down, but he shook her off. In that moment, I didn't think. I just acted. I rushed down the aisle, reached the front just as security was approaching, and managed to grab the man's arm. "Come on," I said firmly. "Let's step outside." He turned to me, his eyes unfocused. "Who the hell are you?" he slurred. Then recognition dawned. "Oh, it's the truck driver. Come to save the day, have you?" I gritted my teeth, fighting the urge to punch him. Instead, I said as calmly as I could, "Let's not ruin this day for her. Please, come with me." Somehow, I managed to get him outside without further incident. As we stepped into the fresh air, he stumbled and nearly fell. I caught him, and for a moment, we just stood there. This man who had everything I didn't, leaning on me for support. You know, he said, his words still slurred. She talks about you all the time. Her dad, the hero, makes me sick. Before I could respond, my ex-wife came bursting out of the auditorium. What the hell is wrong with you? She hissed at her partner. Then she turned to me, her expression a mix of embarrassment and grudging gratitude. Thank you, she said stiffly. I'll take it from here. I watched as she led him away, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Anger at the disruption, satisfaction at having been the one to handle it, and an overwhelming sadness for my daughter, whose big moment had been tarnished. When I went back inside, the ceremony was wrapping up. My daughter was sitting with her classmates, her eyes red-rimmed, but her chin held high. As soon as the ceremony ended, I made my way to her. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, I began, but she cut me off. It's not your fault, Dad, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Thank you for handling that. We stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then she surprised me by throwing her arms around me. I'm glad you were here, she whispered. In that moment, all the hurt and resentment I'd been carrying seemed to melt away. I held my daughter tight, feeling for the first time in a long while that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't lost her after all. The aftermath of the ceremony was chaotic. My ex-wife was nowhere to be seen, presumably having left to deal with her inebriated partner. My daughter's boyfriend and his family approached us, their faces a mix of concern and poorly concealed judgment. That was quite a scene, her boyfriend's father said, his tone making it clear he was not impressed. Are you all right, dear? He asked my daughter, pointedly ignoring me. My daughter, to her credit, squared her shoulders and said, I'm fine, thank you. My dad handled the situation. She squeezed my arm as she said this, and I felt a surge of pride. The boyfriend's mother cleared her throat. Well, we're still on for dinner, aren't we? We have reservations at LeBlanc. I could see my daughter hesitate. LeBlanc was the most expensive restaurant in town, the kind of place I could never afford to take her. For a moment, I was sure she would go with them, leaving me behind like an embarrassing remnant of a life she was trying to escape. But then she surprised me again. Actually, she said, I think I'm going to have dinner with my dad tonight. Rain check? The look of shock on their faces almost made me laugh. They retreated quickly after that, leaving me alone with my daughter. You don't have to do this, I told her. I know you were looking forward to that dinner. She shook her head. No, Dad. I want to. Let's go home. I could really use some of your famous burnt grilled cheese right about now. So that's what we did. We went home to our small house, and I made grilled cheese sandwiches that were only slightly burnt. As we sat at our old kitchen table, my daughter in her graduation gown and me in my one good suit, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. I'm sorry, my daughter said suddenly, putting down her sandwich. I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough. You are, Dad. You always have been. I felt tears prick my eyes. I'm sorry, too, I said, for almost letting my pride keep me from being here today. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. We talked late into the night, really talked, in a way we hadn't in years. She told me about her fears of not fitting in with her boyfriend's world, about the pressure she felt to be someone she wasn't. I shared my own insecurities, my fears of losing her. By the time we went to bed, nothing had really changed. We still lived in our small houses. I was still a truck driver. Her mother was still wealthy. Her boyfriend's family still looked down on us. But something had shifted between us. A understanding had been reached. As I write this update, I'm feeling cautiously optimistic about the future. I know we still have a long way to go, and there will be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, I feel like my daughter and I are on the same team again. To everyone who advised me to attend the graduation, thank you. You were right. Sometimes, being a parent means swallowing your pride and showing up, no matter what. I'm glad I did. Update 2. It's been a month since my daughter's graduation, and I can hardly believe how much has changed. After years of focusing solely on being a dad, I'm finally starting to rediscover who I am as an individual. The day after the graduation, I woke up feeling different. There was a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. My daughter was an adult now, heading off to college in the fall. While I'd always be her dad, it was time for me to start thinking about myself too. I decided to start small. That morning, I made a list of things I used to enjoy before life got so complicated. At the top of that list was making friends. It hit me then how isolated I'd become. Outside of work, I barely spoke to anyone who wasn't my daughter. I remembered seeing flyers for a local community center. On my next day off, I decided to check it out. Walking into that building was one of the hardest things I've done in years. I felt so out of place, but I forced myself to stay. I'm glad I did. They were offering a beginner's photography class. I'd always enjoyed taking pictures, but I'd never had the time or money to pursue it seriously. Before I could talk myself out of it, I signed up. The first class was that weekend. I was nervous as hell, fumbling with the settings on my cheap digital camera. But as the instructor started talking about composition and lighting, I felt myself getting drawn in. For those 2 hours, I wasn't thinking about work or bills or any of the stress in my life. I was just learning, creating, seeing the world in a new way. But the real breakthrough came after class. As we were packing up our gear, one of the other students, a woman about my age, came over to me. We started talking and ended up grabbing coffee, swapping stories about our kids, and laughing about our shared cluelessness when it came to photography. It wasn't just her. Over the next few weeks, I found myself forming connections with several of my classmates. For the first time in years, I had friends, real friends, not just work acquaintances or my daughter's friends' parents. We started meeting up outside of class, going on photo walks in the park, grabbing beers after lessons. My newfound social life didn't go unnoticed at home. My daughter commented on it one evening. "Dad, you seem different lately," she said. Happier. I couldn't deny it. I was happier. I felt more energized, more alive. I was even sleeping better at night, no longer lying awake, worrying about every little thing. But it wasn't just about making friends. The photography class had awakened something in me, a creativity I'd forgotten I possessed. I started seeing potential photographs everywhere I went. On my long hauls, I'd find myself pulling over to capture a stunning sunset or an interesting rock formation. One day, about 3 weeks into the class, our instructor pulled me aside. "You've got a good eye," he said. "Have you ever thought about selling your work?" I laughed it off at first, but the idea stuck with me. I started researching online marketplaces for photography, learning about stock photos and print-on-demand services. Before I knew it, I had set up a small online store. I didn't expect much, but to my surprise, people started buying my photos. It wasn't much at first, a few dollars here and there, but it was something I had created, something that was all mine. The first time I saw my photograph on someone's website, I felt a pride I hadn't experienced in years. As my confidence grew, so did my willingness to step out of my comfort zone. Which brings me to the most surprising development of all. I have a date this weekend. It happened so naturally that I almost didn't realize what was happening. The woman from my class and I had been meeting up for coffee regularly after our photography classes. We'd talk about our kids, our jobs, our dreams. I found myself looking forward to these conversations more and more. Then, last week, as we were leaving the cafe, she turned to me and said, "You know, we should do dinner sometime." without the cameras. For a moment, I just stared at her, not quite processing what she was saying. When it hit me, I felt a mix of excitement and terror. A date. Me. At my age. I'd like that, I heard myself saying, and her smile in response made my heart skip a beat. So now, here I am, a 35-year-old truck driver and amateur photographer, getting ready for my first date in over 15 years. I'm nervous as hell. What do people even do on dates these days? What will we talk about? Without our usual buffer of f-stops and ISO settings, but underneath the nerves, there's an excitement I haven't felt in years. It's not just about the date, although that's certainly part of it. It's about the realization that my life isn't over, that there are still new experiences to be had, new sides of myself to discover. I called my daughter last night to tell her about the date. I was worried about how she'd react. After all, I'd been single her entire life. But she was thrilled for me. "Dad, that's awesome," she said. "You deserve to be happy." Her words meant more to me than I could express. For so long, I'd put my own happiness on hold, focusing everything on her. To have her blessing, her encouragement to pursue my own joy, it was a gift I never expected. As I write this update, I'm sitting in my truck, parked at a rest stop during a long haul. The sun is setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. In the past, I might have admired it for a moment before turning my attention back to the road. But now, I've got my camera out, trying to capture this moment. That's what these past few weeks have taught me, to capture the moments, to see the beauty in the everyday, to remember that I'm not just a dad or a truck driver, but a person with passions and dreams of my own. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe this date will lead to something, maybe it won't. Maybe my photography will remain a hobby, or maybe it'll grow into something more. But for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out. So here's to new beginnings, at any age. Wish me luck on my date.